So this is my K-2SO project. I was watching the Andor series and I knew I wanted to do something with K-2SO, but I'm not a sculptor, I wouldn't be able to make that. So I had a little search around, and there's a place called Droid Division that sells STLs for a load of droids from the Star Wars series, and they're highly detailed, but they're the full prop size STLs. So K-2SO is supposed to be like 7 foot something. Obviously I can't print that off on my little tiny printer, so I scaled the thing down to about 15%, which still left it to be about 250mm from the bottom of the torso to the top of the head. And I just didn't print off the whole thing because I wanted a really like compact bust type thing for the whole project, so the arms were just going to get in the way. And I think in this way it kind of gives it a nice concise view of kind of the front chest, the head, and you're not sort of distracted by all of the limbs that would be there. I wasn't sure if I was going to fully film this project. I started filming during the build and sort of continued into the painting, but I found painting and filming at the same time to be quite difficult and frustrating, so there are parts of the painting which I just didn't capture because I just needed to get on and do it. So the STL comes in a bunch of parts, and you have to flip the reverse image of certain parts to make the right hand side. I found that a little bit confusing. I didn't really understand what was going on at first, but once I got my head around it, it was fine. And the plinth I designed in Blender because I wanted the rod hole, the magnet holes, and the bolt holes to already be there. And then I put the K-2SO name in a sort of embossed lettering. The printing took about sort of 2 weeks on and off. There was about 7 prints at about 7.5 hours each to get all of the parts out that I needed for it, which was quite a lot in the end. And then basically began the sanding and prepping of all the prints. Luckily, the layer lines were basically non-existent. I had to get rid of like the tiniest amount of them. The printer I have is a Frozen 8KS and it's just insanely good quality. Some of the actual putting together of the piece didn't go amazingly well. One thing I learned with resin is that super glue just basically dries instantly. If I was to do it again, I would use a slower set epoxy, so I have a bit more working time. I was putting the glue in and then it was putting the parts together, and I wasn't quite aligned, but it was set and I had to like snap it back apart. I think the build time ended up being about a week and a half, 2 weeks of a few hours a night. There was just a lot of putty work and wet sanding to just go into it to make sure everything was smooth and there was no seam lines or layer lines. I do a lot of wet sanding just because it keeps the dust down basically. There's no other reason for me to do it other than that. Something I didn't take into account was when I scaled down to 15%, the thicknesses were going to become a lot smaller. So things like these grills for the eyes became basically unusable. They were just too thin, too small, too brittle. So for those eye grills, I had to go into Blender and make the thicknesses a little bit more. And for the antennas on the back, they were basically unusable. If you looked at them wrong, they broke. I asked my dad if he could lave out some brass replicas that I could use so they'd be really strong and sturdy. Laving brass at this scale is quite difficult, and he had to buy some very fine cutting tools for the lathe to actually get it done. I think they were just under 1mm, but he did, and I'm very, very grateful because I would have broke every single antenna if it was in resin. And this is where I learned to use epoxy over superglue. When I was trying to force the magnets into the plinth, I didn't realise that the actual tolerances had become a bit sort of shrunk from the resin just contracting. So I had to heat the resin up with a hairdryer and get it a little bit warm, and then basically I just smacked the thing into place and it's just held in with pure friction. Finding sort of image reference for K-2SO was a bit difficult. He only really has the most screen time in Andor, and all of the images I found online, he was basically a different colour in all of them. He's like this grey blue with like brown filters, and it's a bit weird, very military. Obviously he's a military robot, so that kind of makes sense. First steps, I just gave everything a coat of Vallejo gunmetal through the airbrush. Just covered every single surface. The technique I was going to be using later is the AK heavy chipping, so I needed everything covered from head to toe so that when I went into the chipping it would always have something underneath it. For metallic work I use this heavy calligraphy black ink. It's pitch black, but it dries really matte, and I just like the way the finish is when it's dried. You don't really have to be super careful with it because you can just water it down infinitely, so I just slapped the ink on as much as I wanted. I was trying out this weird sponge dabbing of the ink and it didn't really do anything of value, and you couldn't see any difference when it was dried, but it added something, I guess. And then when it was all dry, I took a lighter metallic colour where I knew I was going to add chipping, just to add a bit of depth for when the actual paint gets removed off. It's all focused around the edges and sort of the hard areas that would just catch. I did the heavy gloss and chipping after that, so a super heavy gloss varnish layer to protect the underneath metallics. And then I did sort of 3 or 4 layers of the heavy chipping medium, and I actually left that to dry for about 24 hours. And then I just went straight into the painting. So this is scale 75 petroleum grey with a bit of AK 3rd Gen black added, just to make it a touch darker than it already was. And I just covered the whole model. So I got a really nice even coat. I did a few layers to ensure that it was thick enough, and then went on to the next steps. Something I didn't film was I used a bit of this neutral grey and the petroleum to have a lighter grey on the torso, which you'll see in a clip later, just in case you're wondering why it looks so different. He has these light grey armband things, so I used a bit of neutral grey from Model Colour and a bit of AK 3rd Gen black in it as well, just to darken it down a little bit. I kept the armband separate because I knew I was going to have to do this stenciling to get the two-tone greys that the K-2SO imagery has. So the inner bits are dark and the outer bits are quite light. I basically just put painter's tape down and then scribed along the panel lines, trying to make sure that I didn't really indent it too much and damage everything underneath. And then I just sprayed over the whole lot with the pure neutral grey for a very light grey. It's quite hard to hold because it was like a really weird shape and I didn't want my fingers going everywhere in the paint. And then I just basically peeled all the tape off in this really satisfying reveal. After that was done, that was pretty much all of the base colours where they needed to be, and I just went straight into the weathering. The AK chipping reacts with water, so you just sort of dab your brush a bit and then put it on the model, let it soak in, and the paint literally just peels off in very realistic looking chunks. You do have to be a bit conservative with it. I've made many mistakes in the past where I've overdone it and the chips are massive and it's like, that's just not realistic in any way, shape or form. So I was trying to be very conservative and go slowly, do a bit of chipping here, assess it, do a bit more chipping, and then try and stop when I think it was a bit too much. I'm just using the side of the brush mostly just to sort of force the paint off a little bit. Here you can see the lighter grey, which I didn't film, and at this point I didn't really film a huge amount of the chipping. It's pretty repetitive and very much the same process. You wet the brush down, wet the paint, and then you just kind of push the brush in until the paint chips off. I ended up using my finger quite a bit. I think I left the acrylic underlay a bit too long between paint sessions, so it was kind of not coming off quite nicely. And then just going into all the parts where I think there needed to be a bit more chipping, a bit more wear, hard edges that would catch naturally and all that. The fun part about the chipping process is you can actually just really put actual damage into it. So I use the knife quite a lot in a lot of my chipping projects, and then I just sort of push the paint around a little bit with the brush With the knife, you're just causing actual damage to the model, and it just looks great. You do have to be a little bit careful though. If you keep pushing hard with the knife, you'll go through the base coat layers and into the primer, and then eventually into the resin. And a cool technique you can do is you can just drag the knife edge across surfaces, so it will kind of skip along parts and miss bits, where you get this real cool, realistic chipping pattern. And then again, just sort of chipping with the knife, hitting the edges really hard and sort of dragging down. Obviously with this technique you're physically removing paint, so you will get chips and flakes of paint that you have to brush off the model every now and then. And there were certain parts I was just digging the blade in, getting right into the base layers of the paint, straight through to the metallics, and just sort of almost going into the Chaos Black underspray. You can treat the knife kind of like a brush. You're kind of painting in the chips, but you're just pushing through the paint. And then just using that hard edge again to create really cool patterns. Something I pre-plan in the chipping stage is where I want to place streaks, so like rust streaks, water streaks coming down from chips, so I use the knife just to make these little indentations. Something weird happened with like the resin or the acrylic like varnish, I'm not really sure, but water stains were kind of appearing and I couldn't get rid of them. So I ended up just having to kind of embrace them and just use it as additional weathering. And then the other cool thing you can do is literally just take the knife and scratch the paint. It's hard to do in a random pattern and you have to constantly brush off all of the chips that keep falling off. And that was where I got to after the chipping. I wanted to have it characterful but also not too damaged, so it was distracting. It's kind of a hard line to find. And then this was all the other chipping across the model and the shoulder pads. I may have went a bit overboard on the damage on the shoulder pads, but I figure, you know, they're the things that are going to get damaged the most, so why not? And then it was back to another coat of gloss varnish. I think I pretty much went through half a bottle on this entire project, which may have been excessive, but I don't know, it worked for me. The gloss varnish really darkened down the grey, which ended up being a really cool sort of colour, so I'm not really sure what happened there, but it worked. And then obviously with the gloss stage, you go into the transfer stage, and this was a little bit of a pain. I don't know really what was going wrong, but they just wouldn't come off the sheets at first, even though they were completely saturated with water, and I got a little wrinkle in one and it was just very annoying. So I think this was like my third and fourth attempt of on the actual final model. I was desperately trying to get everything completely centered, so I even broke out the ruler to make sure that the middle was actually in the middle of the model. And then I just used the microsol and microset just to thin them down a little bit and try and soften that hard edge from the transfer. When the final matte layer varnish goes on, the transfer edge completely disappears and you won't see it anymore. I wasn't finding a law-accurate K-2SO to be very visually interesting, so I added in these white stripes. I seem to be doing it in a lot of my projects now. It just adds a bit of visual interest, and you can damage them up as well and put chips in them and scratch them, so it's really cool. You can see on the face one, I actually cut down a bit of tape really thinly, so it had a very thin line between the two solid pieces. Body, I just used the thickness of the tape, as I had rolls of it that thickness. I may have watered down the white a bit too much, so it was really too runny, so I had to kind of go over it in a few coats, blast it with the air to dry it, and then do more coats. As at this point I realised I probably over-taped, and I was desperately trying not to peel off any of the paint underneath the tape. Even with the gloss varnish, you can get a bit too much tack and just rip off the whole layer, and I was going to be very annoyed if I did that. I think making the choice of the lines being a bit off-centered from the eye was probably a good one as well. Plus, peeling tape is super satisfying to watch. Now, I did actually peel off a bit of the gloss varnish on this taped up version. You can kind of see it there on the middle chest piece, but I know it kind of worked. It just looks like a bit more extra damage, so I wasn't too fussed with it, but I probably would have been a bit annoyed if it had have done any more. And then it just went back into the chipping. So I used the knife pretty much just for the face. I wanted very fine scratches and chips, and I was just sort of peeling the paint away carefully. And then for the larger stripes I used the brush again. The white was kind of reacting weird with the chipping fluid underneath it. It was kind of melting in a way, which is a bit strange. I don't really know why it was doing that, so I kind of had to switch between the knife and the brush. If I pushed too hard with the brush, it was just wiping the whole lot off. You can kind of see it there, it's just melting very weirdly. Not sure what was going on there. And then I just came back in with a knife and did very fine scratches. It is probably one of the most satisfying processes, just actually causing damage to the model. And that was it. The shoulder pads I made a bit of a mistake on, and I ended up having to do more damage than I wanted. The transfers, for some reason, started peeling underneath, so I just had to pick through them to get through to the metal underneath and just cause just real heavy damage to make sure that they weren't distracting in any way. I thought I'd overdone it a little bit, but once I got painting all of the oils in, it kind of dulled down and wasn't too bad. So once all the chipping's done, I used the matte varnish just to protect everything and ensure that nothing was going to peel up or disappear as I further painted the model. I like the burnt umber from the Model Air range. It's like a really darkish brown, so I ended up just absolutely slapping it all over the model entirely. I did a really, really heavy layer, and I really liked the way that it sort of interacted with the grey. It also got into the chips and everything and just made this nice little line around all the chips. It was really cool to see that happen. I think I was using a size 4 brush here and I was just absolutely slavering it. So after that was all dry, I did another layer of varnish on top of the burnt umber, and then I went in with this light rust orange colour and just sort of poked it into chips in areas just to show that rust was coming through. It doesn't show up super well on the camera, but when you look at it in the hand you can see this orange colour. I'm mostly focusing on the actual edge where the grey and the metallics meet. That's where water in reality is going to pool the most and rust is going to form. But I am also hitting the interior of the chip as well, so there's a bit of interest to always look at. And then I just moved on to using some of the enamels, the wash track and the kerosene leaks, and just adding stains and dots and all kinds of little interesting variations and modulations. There isn't really a right or wrong way of how you can do this. I just kind of went with what looked good to me. And then I'm just using some of the wash track and the rust colours just to create streaks coming out of the chips that I made previously. This was pre-planning where I kind of wanted them to be, so that I knew that when the rust was kind of streaking out of them, it would kind of just add a nice little bit of interest. I was trying not to make them super dark, but not also super subtle. It's kind of a hard line to find. I also reverted back to using some of the burnt umber. The enamels were working great, but some streaks I wanted like a really dark finish to them, just so that they were very pronounced. What you can also do with the burnt umber is use a lot of water, and you can kind of feather it out so that the streak starts strong but then kind of expands into this kind of feathered out look, which is kind of cool. I think I managed to find the balance that I found right for the chipping and the streaking. It's not too heavy in areas, it's heavy in some areas, and then some of the streaking is more pronounced, some of it's very subtle. So you get these kind of different layers of new streaks and old streaks, new chips and old chips. Worked out well in the end, I think. After the chipping and the streaking and all that stuff, I gave it yet another layer of matte varnish, and I went into this kind of process of using the pigments with Vallejo airbrush thinner, and you can kind of just push it into the cracks and the liquid will just run in like a capillary action down all the cracks. It's kind of like pin washing, but with like a sandy pigment. For the metallics, I basically just used the gunmetal grey airbrush, paint it on, and then I used the enamels to kind of make them shiny, the inks to kind of blacken the recesses, and just did that basically. I didn't end up filming that. I was running out of time and rushing. I procrastinated too much at this point. I use the hairdryer a lot for this technique. The liquid just takes too long to dry on its own. Using the hairdryer just really speeds it up. I'm just placing a load of pigment and then superheating it with the hairdryer for it to just dry instantly. It also dries really crusty, when you use the hairdryer. It just gives this really realistic look to it, which I find really cool. You can just see it quickly changing colour there as the liquid evaporates. And then I just wetted the brush a little bit and just feathered out some of the stuff that I didn't want. I was a little bit nervous about doing this with the eyes because I knew I had to use the hairdryer and try not to get the very thin, fragile resin eye grates broken. So I was kind of doing it at a bit more distance and on a lower heat for this one. The eyes for this K-2SO model were quite flat, so I printed out a bunch more and I extended the Z-axis a load so they had a real huge amount of depth to them. And then I just sprayed them white with the Tamiya flat white. This was just a very, very simple paint job for the eyes. I didn't really do a huge amount to them. I used a tiny bit of blue in the very middle, which basically acted as the iris. It was very difficult to get the brush in there without touching the sides. I wanted to try adding an actual lens into this eye, so I used a bit of UV resin and I placed it inside of the iris of the eye, and I was just building it up, building it up, building it up, and eventually it turned into this convex lens, and then I just used the UV light to instantly cure it, so it has this actual dome shape. It was a really cool little experiment and I'm glad it worked out as it did. You're getting actual caustics and everything through the light refraction, which is really cool. Not technically painting, it's more scale modelling at this point. I had to use this really thin piece of wire. Somehow a bubble had managed to get into there and I just had to pop it. And then I just hit the UV light onto the resin and cured it instantly. And then you can see that dome that is like an actual lens, and it just looked insanely good and I was just so happy with it. And that was pretty much the whole process that I actually filmed. This was a very, very long project. I think it took 3.5 months of on and off painting and scale modelling. Once I got the plinth primed with Chaos Black, I went to start to glue the thing, and annoyingly I didn't consider when I was designing the plinth in Blender that the plinth hole was 4mm and the rod was 4mm, so when I was dry fitting them they fit perfectly, but when I came to put epoxy in, it acted as this kind of vacuum seal, and I was so annoyed because it was just pushing back out of the hole, so I had to quickly just hold it there and push hard down onto the model to ensure that it would actually stay where it needed to. This was a very stressful final part of the build, and that brass collar that you see there, my dad actually made that on the lathe as well. Just added a really nice final touch to that sort of connection between the model and the plinth. I was just giving it a bit of a wiggle there just to make sure it was fully glued. This project really pushed a lot of my limits and abilities, which was really nice to try, and it definitely pushed a lot of my patience in areas, but I think the end results were worth every part of it. All of the 3D printing, designing the plinth in Blender, it just turned out to be a really great project.